Hi, in this lecture, you will learn what the instead of triggers are and how to use them. Sometimes, in a real work, you will face an issue like this. You have a view and you use that view in somewhere that you want to make some DML operations on that view. If it is a simple view, there is no problem. You should know simple and complex views from the SQL lessons. If you cannot remember, you can check the SQL courses for further information. Basically, we can make DML operations with a simple view, but we cannot do that with a complex view. However, you need to use that sometimes. You need to make some inserts with the complex views, especially when you use a tool like Oracle Forms, etc. Actually, normally this is not possible because complex views may have multiple tables with different structures or may have functions, etc. Normally, what do we do for that? Actually, we want our DBAs to run some SQL codes like insert codes, update codes, etc. to modify the data of these views. These codes modify the actual tables, but this is not a good way. Besides, sometimes we may want the users to make that modification by using the views. Especially if you use the Oracle Forms Builder, this will ease your job so much, because other options are not so easy. Without further ado, let me explain you the solution to that problem. It is using the instead of triggers. Instead of triggers are used to apply some DML statements on unupdatable views. These triggers are called as instead of triggers because unlike the other triggers, this trigger is fired instead of a DML event. For example, when you run an update command on that view, that update is not executed, but instead of it, the instead of trigger is fired. Because you say to the server that as the instead of trigger, I will do the insert, update, delete, etc. So do not try to make an insert on that view. Here are some important things about the instead of triggers. Instead of triggers are used only with the views. You cannot do that with the tables because the main idea of that trigger is making the DML operations on the view that cannot be done by default. Since we can easily make DMS for the tables, we cannot use the instead of triggers with tables. So we use it only with the views. They are generally used with the complex views, but you can use them with the simple views too. If you do like that, and an update occurs on that view, for example, this update will not be executed, but instead the instead of trigger is executed. Means our trigger will take the precedence and the normal update will be omitted. If your view has a check option, it won't be enforced when you use the instead of triggers. This is also important. As you remember from the SQL lessons, we sometimes use check constraints on the views or tables to provide some security or data integrity. If you use an instead of trigger on that view, these check constraints will not be executed. So you need to enforce that check in your instead of trigger. Before and after timing options are not valid for instead of triggers. Since this is an instead of trigger, it cannot be before or after an event. It is instead of that event. Alright, now let's open up the SQL developer and make an example for that. First, let's create a copy for the departments table not to lose the real data. We write create table departments copy as select all the columns from departments. Great. Now let's create a complex view to work on it. Create or replace view vw amp, let's say details, as select, let's say upper department name with the alias of d name and minimum salary as min cell and maximum salary as max cell. From employees copy, join department's copy using department ID and group by department name. Great. Now let's create it. Great. Our view is ready. As we use the group by class here, now our view is a complex view and the data in it is not modifiable with executing a standard DML code on that view. But sometimes you need to make some DML operations upon that view. Normally you cannot. Let me show you with an example. Let me copy the name and write update our view set dname is equal to, let's say, executive department, where upper dname is equal to executive. Now let's run it. As you can see, the error message says data manipulation operation not legal for this view because it is a complex view. To make a data manipulation on that view, we can use the instead of triggers. With that trigger, we will make our own manipulations inside of that trigger instead of that DML. So let's create our instead of trigger now. Let's open up a new worksheet. We write create or replace trigger amp details view and DML instead of insert or update or delete on view VW amp details. As you can see, we simply write instead of and then the event names that our trigger will work instead of that event. Now let's write for each row. Now we need to declare a variable to calculate the new department ID. So let's write declare vdept ID, it's PLS integer, and our begin keyword. Now we will write our conditional predicates to take different actions in different conditions. So let's start with the inserting predicate. If inserting, then now we will assign the next value of the department ID into our new variable. We will use it in our insert statement because department ID column is necessary. So we write select max department ID plus 10 into vdept ID from department's copy. Now let's make our insert. Insert into department's copy values vdept ID and new dot dname, and the others are null. Great. Now let's add our deleting predicate. Else if deleting, then we will simply delete the row based on the department name. To make it more stable, we will make the comparison with using the upper function. We write delete from department's copy where upper department name is equal to upper old.dname, because we know that it is null in deletes. Great. Now we will write our updating predicate. But here I don't want the users to update any other columns than the department names. So I will use column-based predicate first. Let's do it. Else if updating the column D name, then update department's copy, set department name is equal to new.dname, and our var class upper department name is equal to upper all.dname. As you can see, we used old qualifier for the var class and new for the new value. Be careful about that. I used old for the var class because the new one is the changed one. So it will not match if we select new here too. Now, we know that there are three conditional predicates: insert, update, and delete. Since we did insert and delete already, the last one is update. So we can easily catch the updates with using else here. Or you can use else if updating then to catch it. But no need for that. Let's do it with the else here. Else, since I don't want anyone to change any other columns with using that view, I will raise an exception. Raise application error. And let's say minus something like that. And let's write our message. You cannot update any data other than department name. And our endif and our end keyword. Great. Now let's create our trigger. If you have some errors here with the old and new qualifiers, etc., and your trigger compiles with an error, just open up the trigger from the connections tab and compile again. It will solve that problem because SQL developer may confuse about the new and old qualifiers in standard worksheet sometimes. So if you compile it from the connections tab, it must solve your problem. If you don't have any errors in your code, it will be compiled successfully. Now, it's time to test our trigger. So let's open up our worksheet and run the update again. As you can see, our update succeeded. To see if it is correct, let's query from the department's copy table. Let me copy the department's copy from here and write select all the columns from department's copy. Let's run it. As you can see, we could successfully update the value in our department's copy table. And because of that, we will see the new value in the view too. Let's query that and see. Let me copy that and paste in here and copy the view name and paste and run it. As you can see, it has changed as it should be. So let's try to make a delete operation on that view. We write delete from our view where dname is equal to exec and depth. Now let's run it. Great, we could do it. Let's check that. As you can see, it has gone. So let's try to make an insert then. We write insert into our view values, let's say execution, And for the other columns, I write null and null. Now let's run it. It is done. Now let's check it from the view. But it is not in our view. So let's check from the table. As you can see, it is inserted into the table. The reason we could not see that in the view is there is no employee with the ID of our new department. Do not confuse about that. So now let's try to update another column of that view. I write update our view set min cell is equal to 5000, where dname is equal to, let's say, accounting. I used accounting for the department name because our executive department is not there in our view since we updated its department ID and it does not match to any department ID in the employees table. So it is not there in our view and I used another one. Great, now let's run it. As you can see, our trigger does not let us update any other column than the dname column. Great, what have we learned from that lecture? If we need to make some DML operations on a complex view, it cannot be done with the simple DML operations. The complex views do not let us to do that. So we need to run different statements to make these DMLs. We can send these statements to the DBAs and want them to run, but this is not true. Actually, most of the times, the DBAs will not let us to do that. Besides, you may need to let the users make these operations. It is normally not applicable. But you can do that by using the instead of triggers. Instead of triggers work instead of the inserts, updates, and deletes based on your choice. You can select one or multiple events with the instead of triggers. So, inside of the instead of triggers, you make the correct DML operations with using the new and old values of the columns in your view. So with this way, the users can easily run the DML commands on that trigger. When the instead of triggers may be useful. Let me explain that to you on a situation that I had faced. While I was working with Oracle Forms a few years before, we used tables or views in the form blocks. The data is retrieved by these views or tables to the data blocks. If you use the table, the user can query and modify all the data confidently. If it is a view, we could only let the user to query the view. But sometimes we needed the user to make some updates and deletes with using these views. At that time, we used instead of triggers to let the users to modify the data in the tables behind these views. You may have some other scenarios in your real work with different business needs and different technologies you use in your company. Actually, sometimes some students may fall into some incorrect thoughts about the real-world examples. Yes, it is really useful to see in a real-world scenarios, but this is not true all the times because a usage or a method of some programming language is mostly used with so many different scenarios. So one real-world example can be totally different than another one. So I think in addition to make some real-world examples, I intentionally make some of them easier or more complex to make you learn better. Because then you will use that method or usage is totally up to you, up to your needs and vision. So be sure that in this course, you learn the subject with the way that you will be able to understand when you need to use that usage or another. So be confident. Just focus on the benefits and the reasons for the usages. You will already see examples for all the usages, and most of them will be real-world usages. You will understand better if you work on a real work. So I think this is enough for that lesson. This is the end of this lecture. See you in the next lectures.